What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Points Per Podcast. My name's Eric. That's my co-host Vishy, and today we're diving into the 10 quarterback vacancies or injuries that are currently out there as we head into NFL free agency. We're going to make sure to discuss, obviously, the potential fill-ins for these quarterback positions, whether it be through free agency, trade, or the draft. And then we're going to talk about some of the potential fantasy implications that could be had for your dynasty teams, or as we get later into the summer for your redraft rosters. So I'm excited to get into this one. Vishy, how are you feeling?
Feeling great. Free agency starts soon, like you said. And I think there's a lot of, this 10 teams, that's a third of the league pretty much. That's really uncertain about who their QB will be going into the season in like 5 months. I think this will be a really exciting conversation. And I'm also excited to talk about the fantasy impacts of, which each team could end up with and really what's the best or kind of worst case scenario for each of those fantasy players.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot to get into. So let's get started. We can pull up this little Google sheet that I have created to kind of give an outline of each of these teams. And before we get into it immediately, fully expect to get a lot of things wrong, right? This is all based on speculation and rumors and just kind of guessing. It's a fun exercise to try to figure things out. But I do think regardless of whether we get the exact quarterback fit correct for each team, there will be nuggets in here that are going to be important and potentially helpful for you as a fantasy player, regardless of whether we're right or wrong. So with that, Vishy, where do you want to start us off?
This might not be the most exciting one, but let's just start right at the top. Maybe we'll make segue into some more teams that I really could end up being contenders this year. Unfortunately, I don't think the Dolphins are one based on what I'm hearing, but let's get into why. So right now, QB they have on their roster that's actually likely to be a starter is Quinn. I think Ewers is how you pronounce his last name. They have a few other quarterbacks, of course, in the roster, including Tua, who's headlined their team for a couple years now, as well as Zach Wilson. But there's a lot of rumors coming out that neither really will end up being with the team moving forward. The Dolphins have obviously had the Tua experiment going now for quite a while, and unfortunately, they haven't had the best results. And given their general moves with the team personnel, in addition to that, Mike McDaniel leaving and going over to the Chargers for whatever explosive offense that might end up being, it really suggests that the Dolphins are kind of entering a rebuild. It might be a short one, might just be a year, but I think, well, two things. I think first, it's going to be difficult to predict the Dolphins' offense as a whole this year and how they shape up. And second, I think it's just really looking like they're heading for a rebuilding year. And so to summarize, they have a couple quarterbacks under contract. Quinn out of that pack looks like the most likely as of now to start next year. If they don't pick anyone else up in free agency, I wouldn't be surprised if they bring in competition, maybe in the draft. But I'll move it over to you, Eric. I think unless you disagree with anything I said, I think that kind of covers kind of an opening for that. I'm curious to hear what you think and how you'll predict Devon Achane, an explosive player, and even Jalen Waddle, who's probably going to be their wide receiver one throughout the entirety of the 2026 year. Because barring something crazy, they're likely not going to have a stellar proven option at quarterback.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult exercise, but we can try to nail, some of the individual components of this overall offensive ecosystem that might give us some hints, right? So you already mentioned, which I think was a great note off the top, that they're more than likely going into kind of a rebuild year. We doubt that they're going to try to force themselves into competitiveness in 2026. They're probably going to be playing for 2027. Now, whether or not they're going to try to find their quarterback of the future this offseason and then, surround them with the necessary talent in 2027, or just push everything, including the quarterback position, down the road, we'll have to figure it out. As we have here in the notes, I do think Malik Willis is kind of the obvious connection to their new head coach, Jeff Hafley, through that Green Bay connection. You already mentioned that Quinn Ewers is the most likely option that's already on the roster. Overall ecosystem in general, their play caller currently is Bobby Slowick, which we've talked about in a previous video. Not the most inspiring offensive coordinator based on the results that he had with the Texans. Obviously, he had that first year, which was a little bit more impressive, but followed that up with a pretty disappointing season. And then, we have the fantasy relevant players here to talk about. So we think Quinn Ewers, Malik Willis, and we also have Jimmy Garoppolo as a kind of rumored connection in free agency are options here. Do we think, personally, but I'm going to also pose the question to you, do we think that any of these guys are going to match the level of passing volume that we had with Tua and Mike McDaniel at the helm, or is it just going to go down?
That's a good question. So, difficult to predict passing volume. I think they're all capable of passing the ball a ton. I actually think that might depend more on Bobby Slowick and how he calls that offense. And if he says we're in a rebuilding year, we're going to kind of revert to a more of a run-heavy game. Although, if I had to guess, I don't think game script will really lend itself that way this season for him.
That's fair.
But even if I think, and they're not capable of passing a lot, especially if game script dictates that you have to pass more. Now, whether that produces favorable results overall for example, Jalen Waddle to end up as a top 12 wide receiver, it's difficult to project because, even stellar or decent players on an offense that's likely going to be bottom third of the league, it's difficult to be hopeful and assume that and project him to be a top 12 receiver, for example. That's difficult to say. Devon Achane has shown, even in instances where Tua's been gone, to be a player that, regardless of team passing volume as a whole, just to kind of be the evergreen player that still produces well and demands a lot of volume. So I think I'd be a little more hopeful to him. But to answer your question, I think they're capable of passing the ball or having a lot of attempts. Now, whether that's going to result in 400-yard average games the whole season, I don't think so.
Yeah. So, okay, you do bring up a good point that I didn't necessarily consider is obviously game script is going to be poor. And so that is going to lead to more passing scenarios. But in my head, I was thinking about it just Mike McDaniel and Tua, even though Tua wasn't, an above average quarterback necessarily, he did trust him to get the ball out quickly. And so there was a lot in that kind of short to intermediate passing game, which benefited specifically Devon Achane of these kind of more important fantasy relevant players the most. And I don't really see this being a scenario like we had in Arizona last year, where, yes, they had the game script, but they also had Jacoby Brissett, who they were just willing to let it rip like 40 times a game. Quinn Ewers, Malik Willis, Jimmy Garoppolo, I don't see that being the case. I feel like the passing volume is probably going to go down based on what we've heard from Jeff Hafley in press conferences so far. He wants to establish the run based on what we've seen from Bobby Slowick most recently. In terms of his kind of play sequencing, his run, pass, really, again, not the most inspiring. And I expect it not to be the most high volume passing offenses here, regardless of who comes in at quarterback.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think really the only thing missing that I do want to talk about each of these teams in this conversation about the Dolphins is maybe like their best case scenario. But to be honest, I'm not even opposed to us not discussing that in depth here, because I do, again, think this is a rebuilding year where their team, their offense, regardless of the talent of the players, I just don't think it'll be high volume, high producing, and particularly fantasy relevant. I think this is just a team we're entering kind of a rebuild year in. And I actually like your note there. I think there's a very good chance they rock with Quinn, who they just drafted, kind of evaluate his talent. And next year, who knows, maybe you draft his teammate Arch. Who knows? We don't know. We don't know what they might end up doing next year. But I think that's really kind of up there in that range of outcomes that's likely for the Dolphins this year.
Yeah, so let's round this team out specifically with exactly what you said, kind of best case scenario, worst case scenario of this group of three that we have. And if you want to include a potential draft pick, what do you think the best case scenario outcome is for this team at quarterback?
It's a great question. I'm going to rule out Fernando. I don't really see it happening.
It's definitely not happening, but yeah,
obviously. And I think we're going to bring up Kyler a lot here with the recent news that he's going to be available likely for literally $1.3 million. I think he'll end up being the best case scenario for many of these teams, but I don't see a fit here with the Dolphins because I don't think they're in a regime to kind of win now and take him on a 1 or 2 year deal or something like that. Out of the options here, I think Malik Willis he might be one of the more risky ones, but I think he's probably the best case scenario because, and this might be recency bias, but in those last few games that he's had stepping in for Jordan Love last year or two, he has looked great. He's had some high volume passing games. Their offense has kind of shown flashes of brilliance under him, and so I think that's kind of a little uncertainty that could end up reaping rewards. That's probably the best case scenario for the offensive weapons. I'll leave it at that. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think the best case scenario is probably Malik Willis. I think the worst is probably Quinn Ewers. And honestly, I don't see a crazy discrepancy in terms of what to expect from fantasy outcomes for the rest of the team, especially Achane and Waddle. We saw Devon Achane finish as kind of a mid-range RB1. I think he was RB5 in PPR. I would expect him to continue to be very relevant and important, but he's probably going to be a lower tier RB1, kind of right on the fringe there between 10 and 12 would be my guess. And Jalen Waddle was, I think, at the very bottom of the wide receiver 2 range at wide receiver 24. And again, kind of regardless of who we're looking at, maybe slightly boosted with Malik Willis, considering the fact that Tyreek Hill is now off the team and Jalen is the wide receiver 1. I kind of put him right in that same range, right in that like wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 3 territory. He doesn't move much for me.
Cool. I agree.
All right. So that will do it for the Dolphins. We can just keep on moseying down the list here. We'll talk about the Jets next. Justin Fields likely to be off this roster is the speculation that we've heard, and not an inspiring group currently with the team. This one I think is going to be the hardest to predict in terms of who's actually going to be joining the team. I would expect that they probably throw a draft pick, whether early or late, on somebody. And there's actually been a million names speculated, but this one is kind of the most interesting. Spencer Rattler and some of these kind of younger trade candidates, Tanner McKee, the backup for the Philadelphia Eagles. The Tua connection seems weird to me. He's just not like a cold weather guy. I don't know. If they're planning on tanking, which, that's something that we also have to address. They do have 3 firsts in 2027. So I do kind of expect this to be more of a stopgap year. Again, not really looking to compete in 2026. So maybe that's the route that they take. But I'm curious your thoughts on the overall situation and if you have any sort of insight into who it might be coming to the Jets this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, we're not starting off with teams that are, just a piece away from winning the Super Bowl or making a deep run. Not too exciting. We'll get there. There's at least one team in here, I think, that we could probably say that about. But yeah, I agree with everything you said. I do think they're actually in kind of a similar position to the Dolphins, where they're not necessarily interested in finding their guy for the next 10 years. Not that I think really anyone on this list could serve as that. Again, other than Mendoza, who we're really considering out of the question because for all intents and purposes, we're considering him drafted by the Raiders. And so I agree with what you said. I think Fields is likely on his way out. The group there is not too impressive, and it would be negligent if the Jets don't try to bring in a better candidate or test out a few this year. I could see like a 201-year deal. I really do agree with your note that they're likely also, in addition to the Dolphins, looking to compete next year, and they do have that incredible draft volume next year. And so, this seems like a year where you take a shot with somebody risky, or you take a bet that's really cheap to kind of hold you over for a year, and then look for your QB of the future. Unfortunately, this keeps Brees and Garrett Wilson in some semblance of a little purgatory. Not ideal for folks in fantasy football that are drafting a running back or a receiver, which is all of us. And again, I think, this will be a similar situation similar to the Dolphins, where regardless of which option they end up getting, even if they kind of go out and get Malik Willis Kyler could really bring up the offense a little bit, but I don't think the range of outcomes is that wide for Brees and Garrett. I think we can cement them in almost similar positions to Devon Achane and Waddle, where they will demand volume. I think Garrett Wilson's an incredible receiver, and we see that year over year again. And he's ended up with wide receiver 1 numbers a couple of these years, even with not the most proven of quarterbacks. But again, I don't think it's an offense that'll be particularly interesting this year, especially outside of these 2 fantasy assets.
Yeah, the thing that really scares me is that Frank Reich is the new play caller there. It's tough to say it's going to be a downgrade from last year because they were terrible last year. If I pull up their EPA, their offensive EPA per play last year was 29th. So it's hard to really go down, but I liked Tanner Engstrand more than I like Frank Reich. Sure. So that's definitely concerning. I'm a fan of Spencer Rattler. If that's a serious conversation that they're having, I think that's at least a little bit exciting, but I was a fan of Spencer Rattler in a Kellen Moore offense. I don't know how much enthusiasm I'll have when he's on the Jets in this scenario. Yeah. So I agree with you. Very similar to the Dolphins in that their best case scenario, whether that be to a Rattler, maybe Ty Simpson in the draft or something like that, it isn't too different from them just rolling with like Tyrod or Brady Cook or something of that scenario, at least for the fantasy relevant players. I think Breece Hall can kind of continue to be where he's been the last couple years, where it's been disappointing, but he's still been viable.
Sure.
Garrett Wilson has been much more up and down, just like boom bust, which makes sense when you're on a team like this. Um, and yeah, he was what, the wide receiver 15 in points per game, but also only played 7 games.
Right.
I wouldn't project he'd be that high, but he's incredibly talented, and I didn't project him to be that high last year either. So it's very possible that he could find himself kind of in that bottom tier of the wide receiver 2 range again.
Sure, I agree. And to round this out, I think I actually agree with the notes you made about who could bring up the team. I think Spencer Rattler, Tua, I think they'd likely be among the kind of best possible scenario cases for the fantasy relevant players. I think Ty Simpson's an interesting call out. I think I'd be, based on like analytics that I'm reading, it seems like maybe it wouldn't be the best move if they were to spend like a first if they have theirs or something on him. But if they get him, in the second or third, which I don't know if he'll drop over to the third, obviously, as a quarterback, as probably the QB2, it could be worth it. I don't think it's in their best interest to really bring someone in that isn't amazing, because they likely want to look at QB in the draft next year. And so then it becomes a question of, are you wasting a pick this year that you could have spent bolstering the offense or defense around the quarterback that you'd eventually like to draft next year?
Right.
I think we heard a lot that the quarterback's either the last piece you get, or you get the quarterback and the year draft after that, you go full kill what the Bears did and just fill your offense with stars and to support them. And unless we're confident the Jets are going to do that, I think Spencer or two are likely decent bets there for this year.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, let's keep it rolling. I think the first 2 scenarios were similar, and honestly, I don't think this one is too dissimilar. So I don't know that there's a ton that we need to add. I do have this note in here that Daniel Jeremiah expects them to start Watson this year, and then be in the quarterback market for next year. So again, similar scenario. They're probably in a rebuild year. Deshaun Watson is going to be on their books with an incredibly large cap hit regardless of what they do. So there's not a bunch of flexibility to try to compete around that anyway. So I think we're in a similar scenario where it's probably going to be Shadur or Deshaun. I do like Todd Monken. I think that potentially makes things a little bit more exciting. I do have Kyler on here listed as one of the free agent connections, as well as Tyler Huntley, who's been on the Browns before and has connections to Todd Monken, obviously through Baltimore. Right. We don't need to spend a ton of time because I think it's just a very similar scenario to the first 2 that we talked about. But do you have any thoughts as to what these guys might mean for their fantasy relevant players?
First of all, with Monken at play caller, I don't really care who's at quarterback. You have to value Fannin highly. I mean, you'd have to have an absolutely anemic offense for Hale Fannin not to perform at least half as well as he did last year. And he had flashes of brilliance last year. And so I think even though it's an offense that's not the greatest, I think rating Fannin highly in that top couple tiers of tight ends is going to be wise. This kind of crop of young tight ends is looking incredible. And I'm really curious about what the Browns do, because we know the cap hit that Deshaun's going to bring to their team after not playing for 3 years. And we know the draft picks they spent 2 last year in Shadur and Dylan Gabriel. They weren't the highest draft picks, but they still did. And so bringing back Tyler Huntley, Mariota, Kyler would be a little bit, not really much of an investment, but I'd be surprised if they don't take a year to figure it out a little bit. I think the things with the Browns, though, as an AFC North fan, is they're always so gritty. They're like little bulldogs. Like they're going to try to compete. They're going to win some games, and they're going to have a tough defense. And I wouldn't be surprised if they just go bring in Kyler and say, you know what, we're going to try our best. He's the most proven quarterback out of the group. We'll pay him and continue to sit Deshaun because we've decided that we're done with him, and that's very possible. Or maybe Todd Monken meets with Shadur and says, "This is the best interview I've ever had. I'm gonna rock with this guy." Because at their first meeting that they had in the clubhouse, Todd Monken goes, "We tried to draft you, but you don't want to come to us." I don't know what's up with that. But sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. I think Fannin will be a relevant asset. He might not have the ceiling that like Trey McBride might have. I think we might get to Arizona later. But I think he'll be a relevant asset. I have always had difficulty judging Browns running backs. I think Quinshon Judkins is talented, and he's going to draw the running back volume. Now, I think that he might just end up being touchdown dependent, so we don't know. I think it's difficult to predict that. I'll defer to you on that one. But
we have to take the injury recovery into consideration also.
That's true as well.
Yeah.
And Dylan Sampson, yeah, he might end up starting more in the early year or something. So.
Potentially. So yeah, really, in terms of like surefire bets, at least to start the season, Harold Fannon's really the only kind of surefire fantasy relevant starter for this team. And I agree with you. After last season, we saw Dylan Gabriel, Joe Flacco, Shadur Sanders all come through at quarterback, and Harold Fannin continued to eat throughout all of that. So I'm not really worried that it's necessarily going to get worse for Fannin. And you mentioned with Monk in there and his utilization of tight ends that that's probably going to be good for him. Otherwise, there's not much to really care about from a fantasy perspective. So it makes our jobs a little bit easier because we don't have to project all that much. I would say that Kyler and probably even Tyler Huntley would be a slight upgrade over what they have currently on their roster. I don't know about Mariota. I don't know how you feel in that regard. But again, another scenario where mostly across the board, we're expecting low expectations for everyone.
Agreed.
Okay. I am interested to get into the Steelers because it's the first team on this list where we kind of do expect them to try to compete just based on their hiring of head coach Mike McCarthy. He's obviously quite old. I don't expect them to hire him to go through a rebuild. And so, again, there is a connection between him and Aaron Rodgers, who's currently on the roster. Maybe that was made in an attempt to keep Aaron there. Also weird though, because like they had a falling out in Green Bay however many years ago. So I don't know that that connection is super strong. We'll have to find out. But I do think this is a team that's going to continue to try to win like they have for the past 20 years or however it's been, even though, you know, maybe we think that they should take a year to rebuild. You had mentioned before we got on for this video that Malik Willis is probably a decent fit for this team. And I'm curious if you want to kind of expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, this might not be the most compelling of arguments, but I think, first of all, I think it's likely, or I believe the rumors that Aaron Rodgers could come back. I'm not sure if he'll garner much of an interest from other teams. I know we actually did just talk about a couple of teams that might be looking for a one-year stopgap, which Aaron Rodgers could serve as. I don't know if he wants to. I don't know if we've heard too much about that. But I really could see a scenario where the Steelers bring back Aaron Rodgers for a year, but also go and get Malik Willis. Malik Willis still isn't the most proven. I mean, I think he still has single-digit starts in the NFL, and there's rumors that he's going to command like a $20 to $30 million per year contract type of situation. Maybe that's I think that's what I've heard. Maybe that's a little inflated, but
I've heard even more. I've heard upwards of like 35 million. So at that point, I think the stat that I saw was the number of pass attempts he had for the Packers is the amount of millions he'll be making per year.
So yeah, and I mean, pretty funny. I think the Steelers, you know, they're willing to compete. They're always willing to compete. I mean, this is the first, I think, the playoff team that we've discussed yet out of this group of QB vacancies. He's a little bit of an unknown, in which case you would have Aaron Rodgers to start a game or two if you need, if you think Malik needs to continue developing for whatever reason. But I think that they have a new regime now. They're likely going to look to get a quarterback for a couple years. I mean, if you're running a new quarterback, head coach or play caller, you know, you're likely not wanting to say, okay, now let's go through some turmoil for a while. And I wouldn't be surprised if Mike McCarthy steps in, picks up Malik Willis, or encourages the team to. And I think Malik Willis is extremely talented. I think he plays a gritty style of football. I'm a little biased. I remember the Ravens game against the Green Bay last year. I think it was week 17 or 16. I think it was 17 in December, where I think he got injured twice. He had to leave the game twice, but came back in both times. And that's very Steelers. It's very AFC North football. He's extremely accurate, actually, surprisingly so on deep balls. And with a weapon like DK Metcalf just booking it down the sideline, I think that's a valuable asset and a valuable play. And so, I'm not sure if it's rumored too much. That could be me just speaking out of nowhere. I do think Malik Willis is a good fit for a couple of the teams on the list that we'll discuss as well, that maybe he's been rumored to more. But I think it would be incredibly intriguing for the Steelers to pick up Mike McCarthy, pick up Malik Willis, who's likely not a 1 or half-year solution like Aaron Rodgers is, and just continue to exist in mediocrity. I think it's a scenario I could really see happening.
Yeah, no, I like that. In terms of worst case scenario, we've heard speculation that the team likes Will Howard. They could stick with him. And really any of these three names kind of below Malik Willis, whether that be Mariota, Zach Wilson, or reuniting with Justin Fields again. I don't see that working out very well for the team. I don't see them being a playoff team. And in any of those case scenarios,
sure.
I feel like I've already been known as a DK Metcalf hater on this channel, but I would be firmly entrenched in that camp if that were the case. Jaylen Warren would probably be a little interesting with some of the less mobile options as a check down guy. So whether that be Will Howard, if Aaron Rodgers comes back, we saw how fantasy relevant he was in that case scenario. But Malik Willis, Marcus Mariota, Justin Fields, all these guys are mobile guys. And so I think that would probably hurt the likes of Jalen Warren, at least in the passing game, which I think is where he carves out the most important part of his fantasy role. It might make him more efficient on the ground, but overall the team would suffer for it.
Yeah, I agree. And we did see, Jalen Warren was surprisingly efficient last year, and I think he has the potential to put together another really decent season, depending on the state of the offense and who they go with. I agree with what you said. But cool. I think we can move on to the Colts if you're cool with that. This is a team I think we have a little more certainty about now than recent days. I think what I know is that they placed the transition tag, I believe it's called, on Daniel Jones. So he is under contract and he likely will start this year. Whenever he gets healthy enough to play, and healthy enough that they deem he can start whenever that is. And I believe, given that, and given that Anthony Richardson has been released or is about to be released, it's very likely that Riley Leonard, their backup, who did start some games last year, I think until Philip Rivers came by, is likely to be the fill-in until Danny Dimes is healthy. Given this, I think you can discuss Shane Steichen, who's still sticking around, and a couple of fantasy development players who I think are sticking around, with the exception of Alec Pierce, who we'll see where he ends up. How would you project their fantasy assets, knowing that even if Riley Leonard is not the starter week one, that they likely will not have a proven or very experienced vet starting week one, and really just more of a filler candidate until Daniel Jones is back? How do you project their offense and their fantasy players?
Well, I think I worry a little bit about Jonathan Taylor, at least in comparison to the season that we just saw him have in 2025, where
at least
he was
the first half of it.
Yeah. Even if you include all of it, his points per game put him as the RB4. But yeah, he was easily the runaway RB1 through that first half of the season. I would expect him to still be, vital to their offense and the key cog that makes them go. And they might even lean on him more, right, with a Riley Leonard or a other free agent option while they wait for Daniel Jones to come back. But as much as I like to hate on Daniel Jones, he was a nice kind of plug and play option with Shane Steichen, who I really, really do believe in as a play caller. And they kind of found a nice rhythm. And so he at least, keeps them afloat and allows all of their fantasy options to continue to excel. Riley Leonard also showed a decent ability to do that, just on a slightly decreased level. I think Jonathan Taylor would still be probably a mid-range RB1. Tyler Warren was another guy that kind of started the season hot and then trailed off there at the end of the season. I think his impact as a fantasy asset depends on a lot of what's going to happen with the rest of the wide receiver room. We've heard some speculation that Michael Pittman might not be returning. Alec Pierce is almost certain to not be returning. So a lot will kind of pivot on whether Michael Pittman is still with the team or if Josh Downs becomes the wide receiver one. If that's the case, then I would see kind of an uptick for Tyler Warren's fantasy ability and kind of his baseline. If not, then I could see him hopefully developing into a more consistent role that we saw like in the early portions of 2025. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think I agree with pretty much all that. I think, unfortunately, it's difficult to project the pass catchers because we don't really know who they will be and who will form that room, and that will impact Tyler Warren. I actually agree with what you said about Jonathan Taylor. I think that folks might actually be a little pessimistic with him this year, and he might be end up as some semblance of a value when they would likely go very early, just because of how his performance dropped off in the tail end of last year when Daniel Jones was gone. But I think we have to remember that when it was Philip Rivers coming on that offense, like, it was difficult to have hopes for them to begin with. And like you said, if Riley Leonard is headlining this offense, and we know how talented Jonathan Taylor is, it'll likely be a run-first offense, at least for the first half of next year, and likely through Daniel Jones coming back. I mean, it's an Achilles tear midseason. He likely won't be 100 even throughout the season. And so I think there's no reason to necessarily fade JT too much. And I think with Warren, it will depend on if Pittman sticks around and maybe who they bring in, even in the draft, perhaps, to kind of supplement the offenses in a pass-catching role.
Yeah, I think just as a closing thing here, you made a really good point about Philip Rivers and what he did for Jonathan Taylor. He just couldn't push the ball down the field. And so that brought everybody down closer to the line of scrimmage, which makes life tough on Jonathan Taylor.
Exactly.
Riley Leonard has the capability to push the ball down the field. Whether he's, very good at that, I guess, is the question, but at least he can threaten that in a
Right.
way that Rivers couldn't. So yeah, I'm not that worried about JT. But let's move on to the Kansas City Chiefs. Again, similar situation where we're just waiting for the quarterback to come back. And some early speculation is saying that Patrick Mahomes is hoping to be ready for week 1. I'm not sure I buy that necessarily, but it's within the realm of consideration at least. Thoughts on that? And also, from what I'm hearing, there hasn't been much buzz in terms of free agency connections or anything like that. It seems like they'll probably just roll with Minshew. How do you feel about what that'll do for the team?
Yeah, so I think I'm not going to pretend to be a good Twitter doctor or someone that's in tune with the rumors here, but I haven't heard much, including Minshew. I haven't heard much about that either. But I mean, given what we know that Mahomes, he won't be 100% certainly in preseason. Like, I mean, it will be really difficult for him to be, and if he is playing, he's likely not 100%. So if he were to not play, its logic dictates it's Gardner Minshew starting in his place until he's healthy. And I think that's fine. I think the bigger problem that the Chiefs have here is their offense as a whole. I think they have a lot of holes to fill. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Like there's asterisks everywhere, man. Like who's playing on this offense? Is it going to be Gardner Minshew and like the Jeremiah Love show for? Like, I don't know. Maybe, probably. There's a chance. And so I think this is going to be a difficult offense to project. Obviously, this offense is good to great with Mahomes at the helm. And I know that by midseason next year, likely for sure, it will be Mahomes at the helm. And I think that will have a positive impact on fantasy players. But I think the uncertainty here lies, because nothing else is changing. Anna Reid's still there, but uncertainty lies with, like, will Travis Kelce be around? Will Rashee Rice's offseason issues prevent him from playing football?
Yeah.
Xavier Worthy's good, but he's a very kind of designed, almost kind of a gadget type player. Like, how will he pan out in the offense? Will they bring someone else to, get a cornerback off of him? And I think there's a lot of questions that remain to be answered. But yeah, I mean, I think the best case scenario here is that Mahomes comes back soonish, and the worst case scenario is that he's hurt for an extended duration of time. His recovery takes much longer than we'd like, and we're stuck seeing the Chiefs kind of test out some other drafted QB as they focus on a tank or rebuild of some sort if needed.
Yeah. I think the only fantasy note that I have any semblance of confidence in, and maybe even that's a stretch, but talking about Xavier Worthy, I kind of put him in a similar realm to like a Jameson Williams, where I think that he's incredibly talented and capable, but he's capable in a narrow window of what you ask him to do.
Sure.
And also very dependent on what the situation around him looks like. And so if the runway is open for him to produce. And so in this case, say Rashee Rice gets suspended, say Travis Kelce doesn't come back, or he's just another year older, right? And he's just not the same Travis Kelce. I'm not going to necessarily hype him up to crazy levels with Gardner Minshew as the starter, but I'm probably willing to buy the discounted price, at least in redraft leagues next year, that he will have based on the fact that Patrick Mahomes might not be ready to start the year. But when he comes back, I think that he could be the featured kind of option in that offense. And I think that's something, if we do get that discount, that could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, there's very few other pass catchers. I think there's Noah Gray, who's fine, capable tight end, but fine. Yeah. This just drafted actually has a couple good tight end candidates. I could see the Chiefs kind of picking up one and trying to find their tight end of the future too behind Travis Kelce. But I agree. Like, when Mahomes comes back, the only pass catcher really here that he'll have strong rapport with, that's not some vet they're bringing in, is Xavier Worthy. And I think that's a great point that you make, that his passing volume alone could dictate a great fantasy placement.
Yeah, I like that. All right, let's move on to the Raiders, who, as you mentioned earlier, we have already kind of assumed, and I think we're right to assume, that Fernando Mendoza is going with the first overall pick to the Raiders. It sounds like Geno Smith is probably on the way out, or at least speculated to be on other teams' radars as a potential fill-in. We get Clint Kubiak coming off the Super Bowl winning Seahawks as the new head coach and play caller. We have some very high-end fantasy options in Brock Bowers and Ashton Genty to kind of account for. I'm curious about your evaluation of Mendoza and whether you think that Clint Kubiak can kind of get the most out of him, whether we care about what his fantasy output is, but more so for the fantasy output of these guys.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think Clint Kubiak is a very capable play caller. I think that this team, uh, regardless of how the past few years or decade or so have gone, I think like they're positioned to be able to kind of enter a competitive phase. I mean, the three names you have on the screen, other than the play caller, are within the first 2 years of their careers, and they're among the best players at their position, at least at the point of draft. Like that's a good core. And we saw last year the issues that they had, and the hope is I think they can fill them. I'm not too in tune with who they're planning to fill them with, but I think like the trenches really could like solely dictate how this offense ends up.
Yeah,
Their offensive line was so bad last year. People were bringing up historic stats about Ashton Genty having like a -4 yards before contact or something crazy. Like I think they might actually be a sneaky candidate to go pick up Tyler Linderbaum, probably likely the best center in the market right now. But and then start fresh with a fresh QB, fresh center, et cetera. But I think there's a lot of excitement to be had here. I don't know too much about Mendoza. I know he's still not kind of like that generational prospect that other quarterbacks and other drafts have been, ones that offer a dual threat capability that have been blue chips since high school. You know, you think he's an interesting case, but he wins games and he brings up those around him. And I don't think Brock Bowers and Ashton Genty need to be brought up to showcase their talent. And so if Clint Kubiak calls a good offense, I think this will be fun. So I think in fantasy drafts, or like for example best ball drafts, maybe even more relevant, buying into this Raiders stock will be one that there might be discounted because of uncertainty, but could be the ones to just pop off. I think it could be really exciting.
Yeah, I'm willing to buy into that level of uncertainty, and also the fact that things can only get better. They were literally dead last in terms of EPA per play on offense, 32nd. In terms of their offensive line play, I don't have like the better offensive line play metrics, but just looking at Sumer Sports here, their sack percentage was also worse than the league at over 10%. Their interception rate was, I think, second highest in the league. So yeah, there was a lot of pressure related issues at quarterback, and also just underperformance from Geno. Whether or not Fernando Mendoza just in a vacuum is going to be better than Geno, I don't know. But I do trust with Clint Kubiak at the helm and seeing what he was able to be a part of, at least with Mike McDonald there in Seattle. I think he understands what it takes to win, that you build through the trenches. We saw Seattle do that. And so hopefully that would lead to some improvement in that offensive line. And also, I just trust him as a play caller for these offensive weapons in general, more than I did with what they had there last year. So I'm more than willing to buy back in on Brock Bowers and Ashton Genty, especially Fernando Mendoza. His number one play is that back shoulder fade. Brock Bowers is catching at least 10 touchdowns off that this year. I can't wait.
Oh shoot. Yeah, I mean they're kind of assembling like the event, like they're just putting out a team of winners, and the winners like individually with their respective teams, but like we'll see. That can't end too poorly. It's difficult to be too optimistic because again, the last few years have gone and how their situation is with other holes in the offense, like with the receiving core. I mean, they have a couple like Dante Thornton, Jack Besh, like could end up being exciting guys. It's just difficult to know. I don't think last year showed us enough. So I think uncertainty might be the name of this offense, but I'm gonna kind of also add in their excitement. I think I might catch a couple of Rays games. I think it'll be fun to watch and just kind of see what happens, see what it's looking like. These are some really talented guys.
100%.
Do you want to move us on to the Vikings?
Let's do it. So we have a few teams left here. The Vikings, in my opinion, easily the most sought after quarterback landing spot, and the team best positioned outside of quarterback to compete for a potential Super Bowl run in 2026. Obviously, they have Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson. We'll see where he is kind of just after the years of his injury recovery and things of that nature. Kevin O'Connell, although he's been getting dragged with how J.J. McCarthy performed, still one of the better play callers in the entire NFL. One of the leading names that we've seen connected with this team has been Kyler Murray so far. Again, just speculation. I don't personally see that as a very good fit for the way that Kevin O'Connell likes to call offenses. A lot of timing-based, intermediate in the middle of the field throws that we've seen Kyler Murray be kind of inept and unable to execute. I could see a potential Kirk Cousins reunion in the cards. We've seen Geno Smith speculated, and if Aaron Rodgers leaves the Steelers, he could potentially be a stopgap guy. I don't know what their idea or their plan is with JJ McCarthy, whether they want to try to develop him, alongside a veteran presence, or if he's even on the roster next year. I'm not sure, but I'm curious your thoughts on this overall situation.
Yeah. So first of all, I agree with everything you wrote in the list. I have seen these free agent connections, and I think I have voiced a possible Kyler Murray ending up at the Vikings. So first, I agree. This is definitely the best QB landing spot of the group. I mean, he has Justin Jefferson alone makes it one of the best QB landing spots of the group. But also, it's a team that we talked about this earlier. Like they're quite literally one piece away from having the ability to make a deep run, and that piece could be JJ McCarthy. He started to perform a little better at the tail end of last season. Granted, I don't think it was against the best teams here and there. It's a possibility, and I know you have him in green there because it's not only a possibility, but maybe even likely that he starts next year. But I think they're interesting because if you take their team and now ignore the team except for the QB, kind of like flip it around, you'd think there'd be one that really should just ride out JJ McCarthy and see what he has to offer for another season, given what they invested in him and given what they gave up to keep him, which was Sam Darnold. Super Bowl winner Sam Darnold. So I think like in that vacuum, you'd stick out with JJ McCarthy. But given that they're probably in a position where they might not have many more years of contention, just given the personnel they have and the contracts that they're on, I really could see them bringing in a vet, someone, and now we have to have qualifications. So this person has to be better than JJ McCarthy, which a good chunk of this list maybe is.
Easy bar.
I don't want to look. I like JJ. I don't want to say too much here, but that's qualification. Someone that really can compete. And normally I'd say someone that could compete many years down the line, but again, that might not be necessary because they might just try to win it all this year.
Yeah.
Now, I think the reason I bring up Kyler is I think he's probably the most proven out of this group. He is uniquely one that, he's only 29. Like he could be the one that ends up leading their offense for another 7 years if he has a resurgence. But I think you've convinced me. I think like you made some great points that he might not be the best fit for how Kevin O'Connell runs an offense. I might push back and say maybe Kevin O'Connell and his kind of QB whispering is what's needed to give Kyler a resurgence in a new place and a new kind of position, a new career, a new climate for sure. But I don't know too much. I think that what I'm certain is I think they'll make a move to bring someone else in, whether that's in the draft or a player. I think they need to. Because JJ McCarthy did not show enough clearly that he's capable enough alone, at least without some competition, because otherwise they would have gone really far in the draft with how good their defense was, in the season. But I don't know who will end up there. I could see any of those free agent connections they have listed being an option, and many of those I could see starting over at JJ McCarthy, maybe at least for half the year, and you just see how they're going, and if it doesn't work out, you go back and evaluate JJ again before the season ends. I think generally I agree with what you're saying. I'm curious to see then. Now I know you have JJ McCarthy green because he's the most likely start candidate, but what would you say is best case and worst case here now for the fantasy players who we've briefly discussed, Justin Jefferson and of course other receiver Jordan Addison.
So I do want to be clear. I don't know that he's necessarily the most likely start candidate of everyone, just of what they have on the roster.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, of course.
I like you said, I believe that they will bring in competition. And from what they've been putting out so far this offseason, it sounds like they're looking for a replacement, at least for this year. I do think that Kyler, especially based on the contract scenario where he'll probably only be asking for like veteran minimum, makes a lot of sense for what they have under contract currently. And I like what you said, like Kevin O'Connell, if we're putting our faith in him as a coach, could orchestrate an offense that accentuates his strengths, Kyler Murray, where it's more of a boundary offense versus working in the intermediate and middle areas of the field where he typically likes to operate. At least that's what I've seen from not only him, but also a lot of Sean McVay disciples and things of that nature.
Sure.
But if he wants to stick in that mold, I do think that Kirk Cousins and potentially Aaron Rodgers would actually be pretty good fits. Kirk Cousins is aging rapidly, unfortunately, and doesn't really have the arm strength, but I think is better suited stylistically to do what this offense likes to do. Aaron Rodgers, as much as we can argue about what he's like as a person, I think is still capable of executing the offense that I think Minnesota wants to run. And I would prefer both of them to JJ McCarthy. So let's say, from my perspective, these two are kind of the ideal. I do have Mac Jones on here also, but it sounds like San Francisco is doing everything they can to keep him on the roster. They're asking for a first-round pick.
I've
Not
seen
sure
that.
they'll get that. I would love Mac Jones to Minnesota. I think that'd be a good fit. But of these options, I think Kirk or Rodgers would be better, considering the fact that Minnesota just finished last year with the 28th best EPA per play on offense. It's hard to go much worse than that. I would see an uptick, I would expect, from Jefferson and Addison, just with the ability to access the middle of the field and to be accurate and on time.
Yeah.
That's all you really need to be able to be capable of in order to succeed in a Kevin O'Connell offense. I don't know that Kyler can do that, and we've seen that JJ McCarthy to this point in his career hasn't been able to do that. I think JJ might be the worst case scenario. And honestly, as much as I think Kyler could succeed in some other places, he's also kind of bottom of the barrel for me in terms of team fit.
Sure.
Any
Yeah, I
thoughts?
don't disagree too much. I think I might be a little higher on Kyler here, just broadly, because I think this brings out a position where the Vikings can now afford him.
Sure.
And he fits what they're looking for of QB for a year or further. But I mean, by thinking like that, I am negating team fit, team strengths, and the scheme that Kevin O'Connell's run, like you said. Generally speaking, I do expect positive regression from the fantasy players there. Like I think Josh Jefferson didn't have the greatest years last year, and I think honestly, regardless of these 7, 8, whatever options, I actually do expect them to have a little bit of a bounce back year in this upcoming fantasy season, which will be exciting. Do you want to move on to, oh boy, these last two, we got more uncertainty. Man, this is not fun. This is difficult.
It's difficult. It's definitely a difficult.
I think the next few months are going to be a lot of fun to get some clarity on where people end up. I'm sure we can do another video saying, all right, now that all this is over, let's evaluate what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I have down here
introduce the Falcons.
Well, yeah, but also legal tampering begins March 9th. Free agency officially begins March 11th. So we won't have to wait too long to get answers to some of these questions that we're discussing. I think it's fun to kind of, speculate early, but obviously we'll have some reactionary videos coming down the pipeline in the weeks to come as we get into actual free agency. But for the Falcons specifically, Michael Penix is the incumbent, but he did just tear his ACL again. I think, not that it matters too much for this discussion, but the ACL that he tore isn't a re-tear. It was his other knee that he's torn multiple times throughout his college career. His timeline is a little uncertain as well, but it seems like he's probably going to miss at least the first couple weeks. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, with a new coaching staff and also new front office in town that didn't draft Michael Penix, whether or not they're going to be looking for a long-term replacement to just say goodbye and separate from Michael Penix, or if it's a stopgap situation like we looked at with those first few teams. Kyler in this scenario, I think, is much more interesting. Kevin Stefanski also in a similar kind of realm of like that play action, intermediate chunk plays and stuff like that. But I think just based on the weapons that they have, I think he could potentially fit at least a little bit better. I think Malik Willis is in play as well. And honestly, Tua, just like a slightly better version of Penix, maybe. Like it could just be a similar offense.
You're just saying that because they're lefties, man.
No. I mean, yeah, they are lefties, yes, but similar mold where they're not very mobile. Even though Penix is technically fast, he's not a running quarterback by any means. Yeah. They're better in that kind of quick game. Penix has a better arm, but I don't know. It's certainly tough to predict. There's a ton and a wide range of stylistic options here to kind of be the incumbent. But what are your thoughts, and what do you think it could mean for these fantasy assets here?
Yeah, I think this will be really interesting because they can go one of two general ways, and one of which will be we want to evaluate Penix one last time, or at least one more time, give another chance. And the other competing thought is you have a new set of kind of coaching staff coming in and saying, you know what, like he's injured, like he'll make a great backup at least for this year when he becomes healthy, but we'd like to bring in someone else to really evaluate, can stick with us for the next couple of years. I think Kyler and Malik Willis are really, really intriguing options here. I think you touched on them a bit. I think that they are more mobile. And so typically, we say that maybe that's not the best for fantasy players as a whole. For example, running backs who might benefit from an immobile quarterback that would check down to them frequently. But I think Kyler and Malik, kind of as somewhat mobile QBs, would actually just elevate the offense as a whole. This offense has the opportunity to be really, really exciting. I mean, they were electric last year for kind of bursts of play with, I think, Kirk at the helm right towards the latter half of the season. Bijan was still incredible. Kyle Pitts put up one of the best contract years I've ever seen out of the blue. And I think, I think Kyler and Malik would elevate that. I think now, with linebacker having to cover Kyler too, that could open up Bijan maybe even a little more. And I think Kevin Stefanski and Tommy Rees, I think they have the potential to craft a fun offense around that. It would require a little bit of a scheme adjustment, kind of like what you mentioned with KOC and Kyler in Minnesota, for example. But I think it's possible. I think the Falcons are also a team that they're just a few pieces away from really competing, I think, and making a run. So to sum that up, I think that they will certainly bring someone. I mean, they have to, unless they plan on rolling with Easton Stick, because we're under the assumption Penix will not be healthy to start the season. And I think the best case scenario would be they just simply bring in a good or the best possible quarterback and then figure it out, because they have diverse weapons. It's not like they need a quarterback that can throw well because they only have pass catching weapons. Like they have Bijan Robinson. And so I'm excited, and I think I might just look at the right half of your screen here, but I think likely at the top of you potentially available. This is like roughly kind of ordered by how good these quarterbacks are, and I think Kyler and Malik top that list, and I'm sure the Falcons are pursuing both of them right now. It'll be really exciting.
No, I 100% agree with that. And you did touch on it, but what this scenario means for these fantasy options, we talked about it in our coaching video where Kevin Stefanski likes to run a lot of that play action, and that aligns very well with where Kyle Pitts succeeds. His target rate and his efficiency stats skyrocket under play action. And that's an area where Michael Penix has struggled. So if we do see a quarterback come in that's more comfortable in the play action, even like a Joe Flacco, like we've seen Joe Flacco buoy some fantasy assets in terrible situations, and this is far from that.
If Joe Flacco goes to the Falcons, they're winning the Super Bowl this year.
I love it.
I mean, that's just obvious.
But in terms of what it means for these three guys specifically, I am excited for what the new coach means for Kyle Pitts. Bijan's going to be the RB1 or RB2 kind of regardless of what's going on, or at least drafted like that. And I would be willing to draft him like that. Drake London is a little bit of the interesting one. He's somebody that we noted in our coaching video with Kevin Stefanski being introduced, that he was the inverse of Kyle Pitts, where under play action, his efficiency stats actually went down. I don't know that that's specific to him, the individual player, or just kind of the schematic things that were going on. And Michael Penix, I'm very much a believer in Drake London's talent and ability to be a wide receiver one, and a high end one at that for fantasy. And really, I'd probably project better fantasy output, if it maintained to better fantasy output for all of these players with any of these guys, I think. Would you agree? Over
I agree.
Penix?
I agree. I think I think we deserve, I think the world and maybe Penix deserve another look at what he's capable of, but the Falcons are positioning themselves to be good this year. They don't have a first, I think, right? Because they gave it up to draft the two edges last year. And I think they owe it to themselves to bring in someone good and really compete. And I think they have the potential to have a really well-rounded and high-producing offense.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move on to our last team here, the Arizona Cardinals. And outside of Las Vegas, who we already penciled in as taking Fernando Mendoza, I do think that this is the team that's most likely to bring in, I hesitate to say high-end, but in terms of this draft class in a vacuum, a high-end rookie. I think Ty Simpson is somebody that's been speculated to be drafted by this team. Not guaranteeing that by any means, but I just think it's a possibility that they bring in one of these guys, whether it be a Ty Simpson, Carson Beck, somebody in that vein, to kind of have a younger guy on the roster. Malik Willis, just as with all of these teams, has been speculated and rumored to be of interest. I've also seen Jimmy Garoppolo and potentially Tyson Bagent, if he's available from the Bears. Jacoby Brissett, I saw in a lot of conversations to be available for other teams, but it's also within the range of outcomes that he stays and is the starter for this team as well. I'm curious if you have any kind of leaning. And again, this is another scenario where it's a lot of different stylistic kind of options that could mean very different things for these fantasy players. What's your take here?
So I think it'll be interesting. We've talked about a couple of these teams where, like, if you're a quarterback in free agency or a rookie, like, you'd love to end up there.
Hmm.
This isn't necessarily not one like this. I think this is one you'd be passing to Trey McBride, Marvin Harrison Jr. for whatever that's worth. Michael Wilson, who went off under Brissett. Speaking of Brissett, I think they owe it to themselves to keep him at least until they have an idea of another option, whether that's talks or it looks like where their draft pick is likely that Ty will be available, which I think he will be. But yeah, I think they owe it to them with Brissett because the fact of the matter is that when they looked at their best last year, and I think when they won a couple games last year, was with Brissett at the helm.
Yeah.
Now, whether that was kind of a flash in the pan, we don't know. But I think Ty Simpson is a great mock to them. They know what they have with Brissett, and they know what they would be getting with Jimmy G and Tyson Bagent. These are likely not long-term options. And with how the NFL has kind of shifted towards a little bit of a model, or at least some teams have, of they're willing to kind of let QBs kind of sit and really learn and develop for a little bit. Like Brissett, Jimmy G, like, these are great players to develop Ty Simpson under, for example, with a decent offensive cast. So I think that's very possible. But I also do want to emphasize your note there that you do have Mike LaFleur is Matt LaFleur's brother. Yeah, and Matt LaFleur basically born and raised Malik Willis behind Jordan Love for like 3 years. And Malik Willis, again, bro has played like 10 games and he's going to get $35 million a year. It's difficult to disregard that. But actually, I wouldn't be surprised if multiple of these things happen. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they keep on Brissett or they bring in Tyson Bagent or Jimmy G. And then they also end up kind of making a splash move to pick up Malik Willis, and then they can get Ty in the second and say, hey, like, we're kind of hedging our bets here, and we have a decent cast that we're ready to roll with for a couple of years. It's a possibility.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to see what happens. But I do agree. I think I was seeing murmurs about them drafting a rookie. I've heard some murmurs about Malik Willis and Jimmy G. I think I'll actually let you take the lead here on, all right, like, out of these, let's just say the names that you do have listed under contract, free agents, and draft. What would be the best case scenario for Trey McBride, Marvin Harrison, and Michael Wilson, all of which we know are pretty talented, particularly Trey?
Jacoby, baby.
Yeah, the guy that they just gotta say that
aired it out with. Yeah, I mean, so of the fantasy relevant players here, the one that was the league winner last year and is going to be drafted the highest is Trey McBride heading into 2026. I don't have as high of expectations for him as we saw from last year, considering he put up one of the best tight end fantasy seasons of all time.
I think it was the best ever. Like, yeah, it can't be that good again.
Yeah, he matched Travis Kelce's best season, I think, in PPR. So yeah, it's hard to go up from that. But if we want to see that continue, at least anywhere close to that level of output from Trey McBride, I think Jacoby Brissett is the best of these options. I do hope that they at least keep him on the roster. I absolutely agree with you in that they'll either keep him or bring in one of these guys and then also probably draft somebody to kind of have that balance. And I'm curious to see how that might work out. In terms of the rest of their options, we don't know that James Conner is going to return. We'll have to see about that. And then Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson. Wilson was obviously very, very impressive when Marvin Harrison Jr. was out. But the splits where we saw them both on the field together, Marvin Harrison dominated the target share and things of that nature, even though, his output might not be what we have hoped from him from a prospect perspective. He still did. He alphaed Michael Wilson when they were both on the field together. So maybe that's disappointing to people because if they are all healthy, they might cancel each other out or kind of cannibalize each other. But yeah, I think Jacoby would be the best outcome for the fantasy options and keeping them afloat. For the team in general, I would be very interested to see what Malik Willis could do there. He's probably the highest upside bet and, obviously still young. Garoppolo and Bagent, I wouldn't be very interested in. I don't have high hopes for Ty Simpson or really any of these rookies outside of Mendoza for that matter. So I'd be hoping for one of these two guys if I'm holding on to any of these guys in Dynasty or looking to draft them in redraft.
Question for you. Do you think a couple other players, do you think Aaron Rodgers going off into his retirement days in the desert would be any better than Jacoby Brissett?
I think that would be viable. Do I think it would be better than Jacoby? It's a good question. I don't know. I think that would be fairly similar. Probably, I'd probably rank these guys in a similar territory, regardless of which one that was. Do you have a take one way or the other?
No, no, I was just looking at other names here because I think like there's a lot like Arizona could go a lot of different ways here. Like they're a team that's kind of they're not necessarily awful. I think they're maybe not positioned to go win a Super Bowl right now, but I think there's a lot of directions they could go. So I'm trying to evaluate like kind of the breadth of QBs we have here and like do a little thought experiment of well, who else could they go to? Like does Tua decide to stay close to the equator and just hop over to Arizona? Like would that end up be like I don't know. And I keep coming back and saying Jacoby Brissett looked so good with them last year. I know he's not the most blue chip of quarterback for the future, but it's almost feels difficult to justify a lot of these guys over Brissett, which also makes me wonder why it could be. I've seen the rumors as well that he's likely just to be a drop or trade candidate, and it's a little surprising to me. Like he showed some pretty hot flashes. Like I'm surprised that they're kind of outright willing to just trade him or drop him, or maybe that's their version of selling high in fantasy. For all I know.
I don't want to discredit Jacoby. I think considering where he's at in his career and the supporting cast and coaching staff he had to work with, I think he excelled. He did better than expectations for sure. But I think saying that he was, I don't know. I don't want. I also don't want to misconstrue what you said. I don't think he was great by any means. I don't even think he was like very good. I just think the amount of volume, the amount of times that they let him heave that football around the
That's
field,
true. I mean, when
that's
someone's
where
throwing
most
like
of the
50
fantasy
times a
output
game,
came from. Yeah.
yeah, that's fair.
But again, not to discredit him, and I already argued the point that I think he would be the best option,
Yeah.
at least in terms of fantasy for this team. But yeah,
Cool.
think that should round us out. Do you have any closing thoughts before we hit the outro here?
Not really. I'm excited for this. I think, yeah, two things. I think we should revisit kind of video like this in a month or two once we have some clarity on the landing positions. I also think we'll revisit maybe this exact template in a year because at the top we got the Dolphins and the Jets, and I have a feeling they're going to be in a similar boat in a year from today. And so maybe we can just open the sheet back up and say, all right, they had Quinn Ewers. Like, who are they going to pick up? Who are they going to draft? But I think it's a fun experiment. I think obviously no one's really doing redraft drafts right now, but maybe some dynasty trades are starting to happen. I think going forward, I think it'll be really interesting, given what we just said, to track like who each team picks up and how we can start projecting and kind of we have to start placing these fantasy players in rankings now, and I think that'll help dictate that.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we hope that you guys enjoyed. If you watched all the way till the end, as always, we appreciate you. And let us know that you got all the way here by hitting that like button. Hit that subscribe button if you're interested in any of the things that Vishy talked about. We'll be talking more about this stuff in the future. And as free agency opens in the coming weeks, we'll be reacting to all of the new additions and things of that nature, talking about the fantasy implications. So hit that sub button and hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all of our latest releases, and join us in the comments. Let us know what you think of our opinions, our takes, our speculation as to who's going where. Let us know where you think these quarterbacks are going to end up or not. And yeah, if you guys enjoyed, like I said, leave a like. We appreciate you as always, and we'll catch you in the next video. Peace.
Peace out, guys.